Hi everyone, I'm Nicole Henderson, editor at the Web Host Industry Review, and I'd like to welcome you all to another one of our WER webinars. Today's session is called Why Federate When You Can Differentiate, and will feature a presentation from Tony Lucas, co-founder and SVP of Product Development at Flexiant. I'll let Tony introduce himself properly in a moment, but before we do that, I wanted to take care of a couple housekeeping items. The first is questions. We're going to save a few minutes at the end of the session for your questions. However, you can feel free to submit them throughout the session using the question function in the webinar software. I'll be keeping an eye on those throughout. But as far as actually putting the questions to Tony, we're going to leave that until the end. If you do ask a question and it doesn't get answered because we've run out of time, or maybe it's a bit too specific, rest assured that we will have a record of the questions and who asked them, and somebody will reach out to you via email after the webinar. Or if you have a question you'd rather ask outside a public forum like this, there will be some contact info on screen during the Q&A period, so you can definitely reach out that way. As always, there will be a video archive of the webinar available if you want to revisit a certain slide or a part of the presentation or share it with somebody else. It'll be in the archives at thewer.com/webinars as of early next week. And it'll be there alongside a lot of our other great past webinars, including a webinar we did with Tony back in December, so be sure to check that out. Now, without further ado, let's get started by turning it over to Tony.
Thanks everyone for coming today. So what I want to do is tell you a bit about basically conversations that we've been having with a variety of hosting companies and service providers about thoughts, ideas, problems, concerns that they have in moving to provide cloud services. This isn't a sales pitch. It's not about one solution is better than any other. In fact, it's very much about trying to guide you on your path of what kind of things you need to think about. Just to give you a very quick background on me, as Nicole said, I'm one of the co-founders and VP of Product Development at Flexiant. We make software to enable hosting providers and service providers to build their own cloud services. I used to run a hosting provider for 12 years, and we actually started building this technology to actually solve our own problems in providing hosting services to customers and trying to be more agile with what we did. So some of this comes from our own experience, some of it comes from what we've heard from customers. Anyway, without any further ado, I'll get going anyway. So the agenda, basically, very quickly, won't bore you with too much. So what is Cloud Federation, basically? There's a lot of confusion. It's a buzzword that's been being bandied around. Okay, the word cloud's been bandied around a lot too, but that's a debate for another time. What are some of the benefits of Cloud Federation? What are some of the business and operational challenges of Cloud Federation that maybe haven't been considered? It's got good and it's got bad points. Then on to differentiation. And we haven't picked these two because they happen to rhyme with each other. We think they're two very valid points. And how we think the key in moving to delivering cloud services from traditional hosting or traditional service provider is all about differentiation. So we talk about different options there, how to actually differentiate, and then the next steps that you need to take as a company to think about what you want to do further. And this is a great example. So I went to see a customer today, actually, and this is exactly the kind of conversation we were having with them, what their current challenges were, how they were looking to differentiate in the market. Classic thing comes up of, well, we don't want to just try and compete against Amazon. It's a really good, it's very much a hot topic, and what I'm hoping everyone gets out of today is, oh, I hadn't thought about that, or yeah, that's given me some really good things to think about, and get you really thinking about some of the ways that you can move forward in delivering cloud services. Okay, so what is Cloud Federation? Now, I'm not going to bore you with lots of definitions here, because if I was going to do that, I'd start by trying to define what is cloud, and you'd all fall asleep and leave the webinar very, very quickly. The very simple context, and in general here I'm talking about federating cloud compute. Obviously, you can also look at federating cloud's storage or cloud cloud content delivery networks as well. but in practice it's directly interconnecting two different environments for the purpose of sharing traffic around. I'm not going to read exactly what TechTarget says, but they pretty much get it right. Federation has no doubt got benefits, and I won't go through them all because there'll be different benefits to different people, but there's things, for example, like being able to offer services to customers in more than just the data center you're based in, or if you're in more than one, being able to offer services in other geographic areas, or possibly with different service levels. You might have a customer that wants something that's gold-plated and HIPAA compliant, or is something that's quite the opposite and is cheap as chips. And what they, just realizing that's a very British expression, half the people on here probably won't know what that means. They're basically very, very cost-effective, shall we say. So there's no doubt some possible benefits for Cloud Federation, but there are some pretty potential downsides that can be dangerous for cloud service providers, and I think it's also well worth looking at those. This is not an attempt by us to put you off the idea of federation. It's just a case that it's something to think about and to look at in detail. So what are some of the business challenges with federation? So I don't mean the technical bits here. I'll come on to that. Commoditization, and what we mean by that is the fact that you ultimately need the lowest common denominator for the service in terms of the lowest functionality, because if you want your customers to be able to move an application from provider A, let's say your provider A, to B, to C, to D, whatever, then they can't take advantage of any unique features they might have, because by their very nature you lock them in, which is potentially a good thing for you. Everyone suggests locking is a bad thing, but from a service provider point of view, you want to find some friendly way to lock users in. Unfriendly ways are never a good thing. But if the service you're offering is forced to be completely commoditized, then ultimately that could actually be a fairly bad thing in terms of your strategy, your growth strategy, being able to keep hold of customers, the attrition rates, etc. Economies of scale. So this is a really interesting one. There's an argument that's made for federation that it helps economies of scale, and we think that argument's a bit bogus, really. Does it help fill up any spare capacity that you might have by you taking other workloads from other providers? Yeah, absolutely. Will it help your margins a little bit on that, so you make more money per server? Yeah, possibly, although I'd imagine with it being federated, your margin's going to be reduced compared to what you'd make from selling the capacity normally to your own customers. And if you're managing your estate properly and rolling it out in a sensible manner, you might find it gives you half a point or something on your margin, but it's not going to be particularly huge. Does it suddenly let you buy hardware cheaper or build data center space cheaper? No, it doesn't. There is no inbuilt economies of scale to say 1,000 hosting companies, each running 100 cloud servers, can buy services and deliver services at the same price as someone that is delivering 100,000 servers. It just won't happen, unfortunately. If everyone started looking at getting into cooperative buying and started trying to do cooperative bargaining with the hardware manufacturers, then maybe it could. But federation by itself is potentially useful for minimizing the amount of equipment that's wasted, and I'd like to think actually cloud in general goes a long way towards that, because I'm quite sure there's a number of hosting providers on the call that have got piles and piles of hardware sitting around that isn't fully in use yet, that having an agile cloud platform could help with and get you most of the way there. For example, servers that have been ordered in but maybe racked up but haven't been provisioned to customers yet, or servers that have been end of life by a particular customer contract and you're trying to resell to a customer but you may need to do it at a discounted rate. Actually using them as hosts for cloud servers and cloud VMs might actually improve your margins far more than a little bit of federated revenue would. Reduce functionality of service. So this is echoing point one in a way, but it's the other side of the coin on it. If you're having to provide a consistent service so that it can be commoditized, it can be moved between different providers. For example, one provider might provide layer 7 load balancer, and one might only provide a layer 4, so you can only guarantee to use layer 4. Or one might provide a hardware firewall, one might provide a different type of firewall. The problem you end up with is the lowest common denominator again, which is the customers can only safely use the minimal features of the platform. So ignoring the commoditization part of this argument, that also means the parts of the platform that you're probably getting the best margin on, which are all the value adds that you can offer, whether that's load balancing or firewalling or whatever it might be. You are actually, the customers may end up building something themselves or abstracting it themselves, or working with a third party that can provide it across more than one provider, but ultimately leading to money not being in your pocket. I hate to sound so negative with all this. It's more trying to bring these points out to think about. I'm quite sure there's people on this call that are going to disagree with me, and that's fine too. Please bring that up in the questions. It should make for a good debate. Compatibility. So compatibility is a big one in that federation is a good thing, but the problem you've always got is, what do you federate to? How do you make sure that's compatible? And the way that works generally is, the way it's heading is that the only way you can be sure is to federate within one particular vendor's ecosystem, because it's the only way you can be sure that the software will even have a hope of working. Magically thinking you can federate resources between your platform, Amazon, and a VMware cloud, let's say you're running KVM, for example. Unfortunately, maybe one day, but maybe for certain web applications, but not today. It's not the reality. And so that, in effect, could limit you in terms of the features and functionality that you want to offer your customers. It could limit you in terms of the level of service you're actually being able to provide. And on that point, onto workload distribution. And so this is a key one, which is, let's just say we've got over all the previous problems, and you magically got your application, and it's got some servers running provider A, and it's got some servers running provider B, and life is good. Well, let's say provider A and provider B, you split based on cost, nothing else but cost, and some of them are running in the west coast of the US, and some of them are running in, I don't know, Eastern Europe. The problem you've then got is you may well find unexpected issues with your workload based on the fact that it's been distributed, in that if the federation system itself isn't workload, if the workload isn't visible to the federated system, it doesn't understand it's not a group of VMs, it's a group of VMs deploying an application. You may well have two servers that try and multicast to each other, or communicate via broadcast traffic, or expect a layer 2 connection, or expect a very low latency connection. All of these things, I know I've exaggerated the example with West Coast and Eastern Europe, but even two data centers within the United States, you could potentially have problems where applications suddenly start to misbehave, and it's very tricky to dig out why. And I'll cover this more on the next slide, but if you can imagine at this point, your provider A, let's call them Acme Inc., and so you work for Acme Inc., and you've got a customer that's using your control panel, and they've got their servers there, and you've federated them out to provider Beta Inc., and Beta Inc., there's a problem between Acme Inc. and Beta Inc. It's a bit hard to figure out. There's intermittent packet loss, everybody's worst nightmare. Whose responsibility is that to fix? Customers screaming at you about it because you're the one they're paying. But you're saying, well, the problem's with provider B, and they'll be going, well, I don't care. I'm with you. I don't know anything about provider B. It's visible to me through your very clever federation system. So understanding the complications behind that is important as well, because the reality is every service provider differs in the way they do service levels and the way they do everything, because that's how, I'm possibly preempting the latter part of this presentation, that's how ultimately they actually gain business. If you are exactly the same as Joe Bloggs down the road, how are you ever going to actually sell more than him? And so you're all different, and so everyone provides services a little bit differently. Anyway, so enough about business challenges. So operational challenges. Kind of going on from what I was talking about there. The SLAs. Now, we all know that SLAs, when it comes to hosting, are quite often a fairly poor excuse for a response, and what the customer is looking for is a guarantee of 100%. That magically somehow gets them more uptime than a guarantee of 99.9%. But the problem is that's bad enough managing when you've got your own platforms and your own data center. It's possible, but complicated. When you're suddenly maybe got a customer who's got different spread across different service providers who may have different SLAs themselves, and let's say there's an outage and it causes your customer an outage, they're going to complain to you. Are you going to pay out on your SLA? Are you going to pay out, do you expect the other provider to pay out on their SLA? How does it all work? So there needs to be a system for the end user to understand what's actually going on and to reconcile these SLAs somehow. And exactly the same problem with support and responsiveness. Going back to Acme and Beta Inc. again, customer's got a problem and it's with a server on Beta Inc. and they send a ticket to Acme, Acme forwards the ticket to Beta, Acme takes the data to turn it around, the Beta takes the data to turn it around, Acme takes another data to turn it around once it's come back to Beta, and the customer's been waiting 3 days and is furious. And that's just to go, we can't reproduce your problem, can you tell us more please? So how do you deal with support when it's not running on your infrastructure? Now don't get me wrong, more and more service providers are going to have to get used to selling different types of services, whether it's through Federation or whether it's through selling SaaS solutions or whatever it might be, that aren't hosted on their physical tin. So this is a problem that's much wider than, several of these are a much wider problem than just Federation, but it's worth thinking about. Quality of service, exactly the same idea. What if different service providers have got different levels of quality of service? What if one's got a guaranteed throughput of bandwidth or disk I/O and another one hasn't? What if one charges for disk I/O and the other one doesn't? They've got different pricing models. How do you deal with those? And that's the point about federated billing. If a customer wants to see exactly how much they've used and they've spread resources across 6 different providers, how on earth do you actually get them to reconcile that data? If they pay monthly, sure, but monthly billing of federated providers don't really mix. It's much more likely to be about granular billing. And so how do you reconcile all that data? How do you bring it into one place? And the final 2 points, which are probably the most important, or certainly the next fifth, is maintaining margin. I hinted at this earlier, but it's all well and good thinking, we can federate these things out, but you need to look very carefully to see how you structure it to make sure that you're maintaining the margin, because if you're building your margin out of the compute and relevant services, and you're then actually federating that out, where are you left to actually maintain a margin at all? Well, you don't end up, unless you're deliberately trying to be a broker, which is not necessarily a bad idea, how are you actually going to maintain a margin for your customers? Because the last thing you want is a customer paying you a small fortune, you're making a margin of 3% on it, okay, I'm exaggerating, and then you have, and then they have a service failure at one of the federated clouds and you give them a 10% SLA penalty. It just doesn't work. So the key is working out how you add value on top of that. And last but not least, legal jurisdiction. And so the challenge with this one, again, is, and nobody's got a good answer to this. If someone has this, that's watching the webinar, please tell me, because I think there will be one day, but there isn't today. The legal jurisdiction, if you've got servers even in different states in the US, let alone in different countries around the world, or you've got something that's running in Europe, different countries and different states in Europe do all these things completely differently. How do you actually cope with the legal jurisdiction? Well, I've got a contract with a customer in Canada, with a service provider in Canada. Yeah, but your service provider in Canada has got servers in the US, and they're also federating it to a provider that's headquartered in the US, but it's got servers in Mexico and London. So where exactly is my legal jurisdiction? So that's a real challenge. Now, long term, I think what's going to happen is you're going to find brokers that are actually going to come out, and maybe some of the existing service providers will become brokers, or maybe it will be a new breed. There's already some starting to appear, that will actually solve this exact list of 6. They will have a tick list almost when users go to deploy workloads and go, well, borrowing number 4, and say, okay, this is what the features that I want. I want this SLA, I want this level of support, I want this level of quality of service, etc., and actually then be able to to justify those and deploy that to those automatically. But that's in the future, it's not today. So why differentiation? This may, to some people on here, I hope this sounds blindingly obvious, but it's been quite surprising when we've been talking to a number of companies that this isn't very obvious. So I'm also hopeful that some people take some things away from this. Ultimately, if you want to grow in the cloud services market, the situation we're in today is that market's starting to grow again quite nicely, that the hosting service provider market in general, and the reason it's growing is cloud. And I don't necessarily mean the buzzwordy bits in cloud. I mean the fact that end users are quite comfortable with starting to move their internal services, internal applications they use, out to service providers. That is what's fueling this growth. And it's going to, the good news is it's going to get better and better and better because more and more is going to happen. It's going to be like the dot-com boom all over again. For those of us that were around back then, that was fun times. The end of it wasn't, but the beginning was pretty fun. So now is a great time to be a service provider, but it's also a tough time because you've not just got the traditional service providers in this market that know it well and understand it, but are maybe a little bit too comfortable and reticent to change. You've also got the likes in one corner, you've got Google, you've got Amazon, you've got Microsoft who are slowly pushing into this territory more and more. And on the other corner, you've got all these traditional systems integrators and business process outsourcers and managed services businesses that traditionally do managed IT but don't do hosting, that are suddenly having to wake up and go, well, we're going to get outsourced if we're not careful to the cloud, so we need to start providing cloud services as well. So if you don't look at ways to differentiate, then that could actually be critical, and it could actually become a real problem for you. And if anyone says, but industries don't reinvent themselves that quickly, I've got two things to say to you, Kodak and Blockbuster. That should be all I need to say on that one. It didn't take either of them. If you'd imagined 20 years ago, we'd have said Blockbuster will have gone bust and video stores will cease to exist because no one will care and we'll all be streaming it to our tellies in real time. Everyone would have gone, yeah, that's a pipe dream. Anyway, so the point is differentiating is the key here because it's being able to provide services that are different to help with customer acquisition. I don't know if anyone else still on this call still uses Google AdWords to try and attract customers. The cost of pay-per-click to attract the customer from Google AdWords for even shared hosting is ridiculous these days. And the problem is that people can't differentiate on shared hosting anymore. So the cost of acquisition is key. The margins in that respect are also key because if you provide differentiated services, then ultimately you can generally charge a higher margin for them. And finally, attrition. Coming back to that nasty word lock-in. Customers don't want lock-in, but ultimately service providers want their customers locked in a friendly way, and that lock-in might be customer support, it might be responsiveness, it might be SLA, it might be performance, but ultimately locking them in a unique way that's differentiated by you means you reduce attrition, and ultimately what's better to do, it's always better to try and keep customers than attract new ones. So how to differentiate? There's a lot of different ways that you could differentiate in this industry, and here are a few that we think about. So the first point is focus, and that really should be a heading. I should have changed that. Should be a heading rather than a point. The key is to have a particular focus. Do not be all things to all people. You're not a service provider that does every single service and does it brilliantly and does shared and dedicated and colo and managed and exchange hosting and SharePoint hosting and everything else and is the best at it. Even if you are, your customers aren't going to believe you. It's like going to a restaurant that's got a menu that's 17 pages long and has Indian and Asian and Chinese and French and Thai. You just don't believe that they can actually cook all them to the best level. So the key thing is to focus on a particular area. So just to talk about some of those areas fairly quickly. A particular industry. This is a fairly obvious one, but a good one. If you specialize, if you have specialized knowledge in a particular industry, and that industry could be anything. It could be travel agents, or it could be pharmaceutical giants, or it could be the aerospace or medical or government, focusing on a particular industry and selling into that industry in the way that you know and you understand and you have the contacts. That alone can actually be a really good differentiator. To add to that, what you can also do is vertical clouds. So what I mean by a vertical cloud is building the physical tin you build the cloud out of, building it to suit specific use cases. So building a cloud specifically for pharmaceuticals, for example, or building a cloud that basically allows you to offer certain levels of service that you couldn't do any other way. So that could be, for example, I'm trying to think of a good example now. That's not pharmaceutical. It could be that you have customers that want to run very, very large computational with very large amounts of RAM. So being able to say, right, I can offer virtual machines that have got 128 gigs of RAM, for example, is a differentiator. Being able to say that you can guarantee monthly billing, or being able to say that all your, sorry, I meant hourly billing. Being able to say that you run all of your systems on SSDs, so the IOPS you can provide can cater to specific markets as well. So think about if you're wanting to build for a particular market, it's not just sales focus, it's how you build the product as well. So products, so what you actually offer and how you do it. Do you want to sell completely self-service, unmanaged services by the hour and try and compete with Amazon? Little tip, probably not a good idea. Or do you want to offer a managed service? Is there some ways you can actually hold their hand in terms of what they do? Is there value-added products that you can deliver, such as load balancing, firewalls, other network services that you can offer? User experience, so this is a really important one. One of the things that we've found is a lot of companies are a little scared of how their end users consume resources, because the end user can find it bewildering, the service provider can find it actually hurts on support, for example. And one of the things that we've always said, our mantra in this has always been what we call the email test, which is that if it's easier for the customer to send you an email asking you to do it than it is for them to do it themselves, you haven't got a hope of them actually doing it themselves. So who are your users? How do you actually get them to consume the resources? What are they looking for? Are they looking for an interface that allows them to see thousands of virtual machines, or is your typical user a customer that buys one VM? How can you customize that? How can you make it easier for them? Localization. Now, I appreciate I can't see from here who's on the call and who's not, but I'm presuming there's probably a fair number from the US and spattering from other places in the world. Localization to smaller countries and things can actually be really, really important. And the same with geography, that I'm coming on to the same point. Being able to provide services that are either customized to that country, whether it be language or the way it's, not just language, but the way it's presented, the way it's phrased. Actually being able to do that is very important, as is actually being able to provide services in a specific country. So, for example, customers, we've been speaking to various different potential customers of ours that are in South America, and they're quite keen on using a provider in South America. Funny enough, we're talking to a provider from Spain who's actually picking up an awful lot of business from South America. And you'd go, well, why on earth would they do that from Spain? And then the button drops, or the penny drops rather, which is that they all speak Spanish. And so purely because their interface is in Spanish, they're actually picking up customers. And finally, last but not least, application delivery. And this is probably actually the biggest point, which is at the end of the day, if end users are looking to move internal applications out to the cloud, what they're not looking for is a VM or a disk or a bit of network or a subnet. They're looking for you to help deliver them their application. And they might be looking for it from a point of view of delivering a pre-configured application stack, so they can just go, oh, okay, I want that WordPress cluster. Click, done, good, great. They might be looking for you, and this again comes back to focus on particular industries or products, but focus on delivering particular services. So you might be really, really good at providing Exchange services or hosted SharePoint or LAMP stacks and customization and speed management or whatever it might be. So being able to actually provide them the applications that they're looking for internally and help them manage them, because well, you mean they're crying out for it. Okay, so what are the next steps? What are the things that you should take away from this and do? Well, first of all, the key thing is we've spoken to a lot of people that have tried to build cloud platforms, some of them very successfully. I should say not all with our software. We're interested in talking to anyone. And some of them that it hasn't worked out so well. I think it's fair to say that it's been interesting that companies like GoDaddy, for example, launched their own cloud software, cloud infrastructure as a service business, and then pulled it from the market. And the problem is that too many of them try and do the phrase boil the ocean. They try and create a solution that fits all their customers very easily. And so, generally speaking, you've probably got a fairly wide, varied set of customers. So what you need to do, identify your customers, identify who they are. I know, I don't mind admitting, when I was running the hosting provider, we had, I don't know, 6,000, 7,000 customers. We, in general, had a very poor knowledge of actually what our customers were, what industries they were in, what they were doing, which ones were growing, which ones were shrinking, apart from the bills they had with us. And I suspect that's fairly common for a number of companies. Identify your customers, segment them into relevant areas, and that could be size, it could be industry, it's whatever makes sense to you that appears out of the data. Identify the customer needs, so identify the specific needs that certain groups need. Look back at your existing strengths. What is it that customers have come to you for in the first place? What is it that they like about you? And what can you build on? Because if something of yours is a huge weakness, then that might be an opportunity to build on it, or it might be an opportunity to go, nope, that's not our focus area, let's look somewhere else. And in doing that, learn how you can actually add value to that particular group of customers. And I don't mean 5 customers out of 10,000. Try and find a reasonable amount that you can actually advertise a service to that is really interesting to them. Hopefully using a platform that's flexible enough to offer different sets of services to different customers. Get that service to market and experiment with it and see what customers make of it, but get it to launch quickly. We're talking to some service providers now that are talking about not being ready to go to market for another 18 months or so, and I'm pretty blunt with them going, well, that's fine if you want, but you're going to be far too late. There's going to be nothing left to have. It really is a land grab moment. So it's about identifying what you can do, getting it to market, and then learning from it. You will learn a lot from it. Some of the use cases we've seen our customers come up with have been remarkable, and they're like, we never expected to have use cases like this. Some of them have caused problems. Some of them have brought them in stacks of revenue. And finally, adapt and learn from it. Learn how you can improve what you offer to those customers, and learn what you can from that, what you can do for the other segments of customers that you've got. But don't try boiling the ocean. Don't try going and competing with Amazon and saying, oh, look, I can beat them by 10% on price. Nobody's going to care. It's about providing differentiated services and being able to offer something unique to your customers. Okay, so very quick summary, because I've just about talked enough. The status quo no longer works, and what I mean by that is being able to think, I can do this $5 cheaper than the next guy, or I offer 10% more disk space than the next guy, or my service specs are better than the next guy. Customers buying resources these days do not care about things like that. The value proposition has changed. It's about what extra value you can add and how you differentiate and how you add value to their business. That's what they're buying on. And literally, you might well see, for example, someone looking at 2 different providers. One of them is $150 and one of them is $300, and they go to the $300 one purely because of something that differentiates them, and the price difference would be immaterial to them. Um, federating to provide additional services is a possible route. We personally don't think it's the best growth route. We think finding ways to differentiate is a growth route, and we actually think that federation, certainly for smaller providers who might be at greater risk here, is actually quite a risky route, because they can potentially put themselves into an area where they're risking commoditization, and they're risking basically becoming archaic, outdated in terms of not actually being able to provide the services the customer's looking for. The key for us is differentiation through adding value-added services, so you get your customers in easier and cheaper, you get them sticky, they stick around because they want to stick around, not because they're stuck in with you, because that's not a good way to keep a customer. And ultimately that then leads you to additional revenue growth opportunities through upselling and possible partnerships with other services, or selling other solutions with other companies as well. So that's pretty much me. I'm just about timed that one right. So just got a few minutes left for any questions. If anyone wants to email me, tell me I'm talking rubbish, tell me I've just made their day, tell me they couldn't stop laughing, I don't mind which, by all means send me an email, or find me on Twitter just @TonyLucas. Okay, thank you very much all for listening, and back over to Nicole.
Okay, thanks, Tony. That was great. So I've got a question here. Can you describe a little bit about how federation is a little bit different than partnerships? Because I know you touched on partnerships a little bit near the end, and I'd love for you to describe that a little bit, just to make it clear for everyone.
Sure. So there's an interesting theory that there's another definition that we thought about putting in this presentation, that some other people are defining federation as providing a marketplace of related services, which we're a bit confused by because we can't see how that's federation. If you look at the dictionary definition, and to be fair, I can't quote it off the top of my head, but it's basically about being able to provide a service where customers can move workloads from one provider to another, who are they're part of the same ecosystem, they're working together, whether loosely or tightly, and the customer can expect the same level of service, hopefully, just outline some of the problems with that, expect the same level of service, the same functionality from any of the different providers. The difference, the flip side of this actually, is when you are, and this is the key to differentiating, we think, is actually working with a group of providers is a good thing. Service providers typically aren't actually great at working with lots of other companies in revenue share models or models like that. But actually working with other providers who can add distinct value, and whether they're offering managed services, whether they're even offering other hosted solutions that aren't even hosted in your data center. The customers are actually crying out for service providers to be the new IT department, to be the go-to guys they go to for any problem they might have. So they are looking for service providers to solve a much wider range of problems, and partnerships from that point of view can be really invaluable to actually being able to always, whenever the customer says, can you do this, the answer is yes. But that's not the federation point that we're making here. That's where you're all providing the same service and just trying to move it around for cost or capacity reasons.
Right, okay. And you touched a little bit about how, I know providers who kind of, evangelize the federation model say that it's cheaper for them, and they can, have more capacity and be in more markets. And you kind of disputed that a little bit. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I don't disagree with the point that they can be within more markets. Absolutely, and it's definitely the cheapest way. If you wanted, for example, to experiment and say, okay, well, I wonder if I might get customers in Mexico or Azerbaijan or wherever it might be. If there's a provider already over there, can I use their service and can I brand it and see what happens? That's definitely a viable route as a way of testing, putting your toe in the water. The problem is that is not actually cheaper. It's cheaper in that view, but in terms of on an ongoing basis providing services, what you actually find is that the hosting provider that you're using, you're federating to, still wants his cut. And so you may well find literally all you're doing is your margin will be less than you providing it in your own data center. Because, very simple example, let's imagine, so you've got a customer that's paying $100 a month. The service normally costs $50 to provide. The provider takes a $50 profit margin. Not quite the right numbers, but nice and easy to round. Okay, so now they've federated out. The service provider who is actually running the workload still wants its $50, and in fact he wants his profit margin, which would take him up to 75. But because he's federating and because he's trying to be nice, he's willing to reduce his profit margin. So he say he goes down to $65. So he's lost, if you're in that context, you've lost 40% of your profit margin. And for the provider that's actually being federated from, so he's getting the other bit, instead of the $50 he's only making 35. So there is benefits to it, but to say it's cheaper, I think is a little too simple an argument. There is reasons why you might want to do it temporarily, and there's potential use cases for it, but as a growth strategy, to say, right, well, what we're going to do is federate all our workloads out to other providers and not add any value is flawed in my case, and it's all in that last point. If you as a service provider say, you know what, my skill is adding this particular value, it's managing Exchange servers or managing LAMP stacks or whatever it is, and actually running the tin, running the hardware is an irrelevance to me, I'd rather not do it, then absolutely. Being able to use a service like that is, being able to federate across multiple companies is absolutely of potential value. But you're not really a traditional service provider at any point in that. You're more offering a as a service solution. So that's why I don't think it quite works in this use case. But you might well find people that is a good model for.
Right. Okay, great. So a lot of service providers, the question that's top of mind for them is how can they compete with Amazon? And can you explain a little bit about how you think that differentiation can help smaller service providers, not necessarily compete with Amazon, but maybe create a compelling offer for their targeted market?
Sure. And so a lot of people argue. I speak to a number of service providers, and they say, "Well, I've done the numbers on what Amazon's selling. I can sell it as cheap as that." And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm sure you can. I know I've done the numbers too. It's not that hard to sell storage or disk I/O bandwidth cheaper than Amazon is selling it. They're probably making a fairly good margin on it." But people aren't generally going to Amazon because it's cheap. They're going to Amazon for the agility and the flexibility that the platform offers and all of the other value-added services that they've got, because Amazon isn't about EC2. It's about S3 and EBS and the million other, I forget all the acronyms, but you can go and look them up on their website. They've got a massive range of other services that they offer. And what they offer there is what's differentiating them. These days, actually being able to buy a VM by the hour is not really a differentiator. It was for them when they launched. It was awesome. But that in itself is not a differentiator. The fact that they're in multiple data centers isn't a differentiator. Rackspace could equally argue that, as could others. It's all the other services that they offer. And so what you need to look at and go is, well, I probably can't sell it. Well, I could sell it cheaper than Amazon, but I'd be scraping the barrel, so I don't really want to do that. So how do I win customers? And it comes back to, well, what makes you special? How have you already won customers? What do you already do to differentiate? And if the answer is nothing, then I'll be the first to say, well, you've got a problem. You need to find something to differentiate. You need to find an area to be the best at. And that could be any of the reasons that we talked about there, or other things that we haven't thought about. But the suggestion that trying to take Amazon on their own game in any way is just pretty foolhardy, to be honest.
You're back. We lost you for a minute, Tony. Are you still there?
Sorry. Yeah, I was busy chatting away, and then I didn't realize it had cut me off.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
back now. Sorry.
Okay, that's okay. We've got one last question for you. Trust is a key differentiator, and then the question is, so other than customer references and competition trashing, how these days can we get that trust equation sorted?
That's a really, really good question, and I think whoever comes up with a cracking answer for that will make a lot of money. I think one way, unfortunately, is that some of that will actually come through not a new type of broker, because the problem is there is brokers coming up these days that, in the same way that you get brokers for insurance that are starting to sell compute services. And you might say, well, that's a funny way of actually, that's the one thing that isn't going to do is build a relationship and build trust. But I think what you might find is brokers that actually rate companies based on service levels and things that they can feed back on. In the same way that you get brokers that sell bandwidth these days that feed back on latency, stability, uptime, etc. So that's one way, but that's not the greatest way. It's an interesting one. I think it might come back to what is your target market, because if your target market is every small business across America, that's a tricky one. If your target market is everyone in a certain geographic area, that's a very different approach. There's ways you can do that by being open, being honest, going out actually face-to-face and doing things with these different companies. One way may well be, coming back to the partnership thing again, actually working with partners on that. So is there partners that can, not only partners that can deliver value-added service, but I'm going to get rather geeky here for a minute. In the same way that you have SSL certificates that have a chain of trust, so you have VeriSign and then it goes down to the, if there's an intermediate certificate, and then you've got your certificate, etc. That's exactly how trust works in the real world. So if you've got partners or resellers that do have a trusted relationship with customers, you need to be looking to leverage those kind of relationships to actually get them introduced to you and start working those their sales funnels to see how they can help. That's one thing I've seen that traditionally an awful lot, and the hosting company I used to run was equally guilty of this, had an amazing reseller base but didn't build it, didn't work with it. I had 200 resellers, and what did I do? I sold them as much as they could eat for £50 a month. The one thing I didn't try and do was actually help them sell more or work with them to sell to their customers. And so it's very much about a trust chain. If your resellers trust you, their customers trust them, you can actually use those kind of things to build out. And I think resellers is possibly a key part of that, whether it's resellers or whether it's other partners. But it's building that trust network out through third parties, trying to do it. If you're a brand new startup, or even if you're, let's say you're a hosting company turning over several $1 million, building nationwide trust, if that's what you want to do, it's a tough ask. So I'd be looking at how you can leverage other people's trust.
Okay, great. That was a good answer. So I think those are all the questions we have today. Is there anything you wanted to add, Tony? Anything you think we've missed?
No, I think we've covered it fairly well. Thank you all for coming. So if anyone does want to tell me I'm talking rubbish or tell me I've made the day, then by all means let me know. Very happy to continue the conversation as well if anyone wants to have a chat either on Twitter or drop me an email. And thank you for hosting, Nicole.
Well, thank you. So that's about all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank everyone for attending and for submitting your questions. And of course, I'd like to thank Tony for taking us through a subject that's really challenging for hosting providers today. Thanks again, and have a great day.